Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Curious Talks. This is a conversation with Sai, who is a co-founder of Scapic, which is a no-code platform for building augmented reality experiences. His company was recently acquired by Flipkart, and for that I sat down with him to talk about the acquisition, the future of augmented reality, and other emerging technologies. Disclaimer before starting the video: this was shot on 16 January, due to which there are some topics which I would have talked about, but we didn't talk about, like NFTs and GameStop. If you want to skip to any particular part, there are timestamps in the description, and I hope you would like this conversation. Does Scapic work for the viewers who might not know about it?
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me in the first place, Kshitij. Scapic's been a fairly interesting journey. My name is Sai, and I'm sort of your textbook definition of an accidental entrepreneur. And over the last, say, couple of years, a team of really talented people and I have just been working on how do we bring augmented reality, virtual reality, and a few technologies that are out there which are in the deep end of the spectrum. And they seem very promising to the future, but how do we really trickle it down to use cases that make a lot of sense today, now, here? One of the things that we realized was missing was an easy to develop content pipeline. So we built Scapic. So Scapic is a no-code platform that lets users build virtual reality and augmented reality experiences without really coding them. And through the recent acquisitions, we think it's going to be really exciting to see the world of e-commerce start to use some of these technologies and start showing you products. So the next time you purchase a sofa, a bike, or even say a pair of shades, you're going to be possibly wearing them in AR and taking a look at them, or helping understand how these products might look, feel, and function before you make that purchase itself. That's the promise of the technology, at least as of today, as it stands.
One of your favorite movies, I was hearing TEDx talk where you have talked about Social Network. After your internships, first day you had gone and binge watched it thrice. So, like, what was the motivation which came from that movie, and like, is there any particular lesson which you would like to share, or any?
I feel really old now looking back. Over 8 years ago is when that part of the journey started. I think a lot has to do with storytelling, right? When you sort of step back for a second, either it be the movies that we watch, the things that we sell, or the companies that we build, inherently, we're all storytellers. We all want people to believe in a certain version of how the world works. And the ones who tell the best stories are inevitably some of the better entrepreneurs that we've seen out there, the Steve Jobs, the Elon Musks of the world, etc. I mean, Social Network was that kind of a movie, wasn't it? It just helps understand that during your years in college, you could actually spend that time building something meaningful, right? Like if you notice, a lot of our years in college possibly revolve around the classroom and how do you bunk the classroom. That's about it, right? Uh, but I think the movie was very useful in just providing a fundamentally different angle, in that you could be a kid sitting in a dorm right now in front of a laptop, just trying to get inspired. And it's very much possible for you to create the next big thing, right? And that sense of creating value from nearly nothing at all and just an idea is very empowering. And I think the Social Network does a great job of just showcasing that as the key part of the movie itself.
What was the impact of, like, we going to Stanford?
I think through engineering undergrad, I had a fairly non-linear way of completing 4 years, which was I started building companies when I was in college itself. I usually highly recommend that people try that as an approach, because you're fairly de-risked, right? Like, what's the worst that can happen? You go back to study. So when I started building small side projects as well as ventures back in college, it taught me a lot. As a part of that process, right after I graduated, I was lucky enough to be part of Stanford, and it was during that time that I really grew as an entrepreneur, which is helping think of companies not as technology projects that you build, but rather as living, breathing things that possibly end up taking 3, 5, 7, 10 years to possibly build out, right? Some of the most endearing companies that you see out there have lasted for decades, and some of the most fast growing startups too have possibly lasted for half a decade. So these things take time, persistence, and a dogged amount of belief in your vision. In between all of this, I think building a company is very different from building a project, if we call it that, right? So in engineering, if you are a part of that ecosystem, you're taught on smaller feedback cycles, right? Like you study one night and the next day you wing an exam, or you possibly attend one semester in order to see what it's through. Your feedback cycles are fairly small. Now, with building an org or building a company, that's totally different, right? You're building by listening to people. You're learning on the fly. There are so many aspects that I believe college sets us up poorly for, that I think you as an individual can jump across if you make the effort in order to try building something, because it really teaches you much. I think
Can you
Stanford's a
elaborate
more
on that part? On that part, like what college sets you up on, does not set you up on for aspects of life.
I think plenty. I don't want to sound like a ranty old man, right? But at the same time, I think it's important to be very cognizant that the concept of institutions in India is built around a cookie cutter, right? Or a cookie cutter where you have a template, you have everybody who is to adhere to that template, and the ones who don't adhere are sort of ostracized, marginalized, and made to seem that they have a lack of competency and not a different competency per se, right? If you're not great with mathematics, you're a bad student, right? It's not the concept of you might be good at something else. It's always the concept of you're a bad student. Now, how do we start realizing that there are a huge number of people out there with layers of creativity that the average academic student might only dream about, who are possibly not having the right system to go through an appreciative process of that, right? Like, and that's tough. Building a product, building a company, building a SaaS tool, or being really good as a content creator has nothing to do with the logarithms that you might be wanting to memorize or the tables that you could use, which has nothing to do with covalent bonds in organic chemistry. I can assure you that, right? So now in these scenarios, how do you start developing a structure where you're able to foster talent that is out of the ordinary, right? The whole system is built into appreciating the ordinary, that anybody who strays out from that is looked with a different lens, and this lens is not very appreciated. So I'm not here to preach about we need a systemic change, so on and so forth. Just do the little things better, the little things that help understand that the world is not about the GPA. It hardly is, right? But how do we start building a shared sense of ownership and community around things that we're passionate about? Create an economy of passion around being a student.
So,
right?
like
I think
creating a rewarding experience for doing stuff which is different and contrarian.
absolutely, right. The only way you have any value in life over a long enough period of time is if you do something contrarian and you're right. If you're wrong, so be it. You learn through the process. But if you're going to do non-contrarian work all your life, you're like a Tetris block. And you know what happens to a bunch of Tetris blocks when they all come together. They're invisible, they disappear. Right. So I think that the ability to be non-contrarian is deeply underappreciated. The ability to be contrarian is even worse, where we not only not appreciate it, but we look at it with a stigmatizing eyesight.
Okay. One thing which caught my eye while I was reading through your work was that you have called yourself a one-trick pony. Can you like explain the statement?
Right. So so it's interesting, isn't it? Ever since college, I think a lot of my life revolved around how do I build something, right? I was deeply curious about what does it take in order to go from 0 to 1, right? Possibly build something that the world wants. This very idea that you can be sitting in a deep, dingy, dark room and actually build something that the rest of the world ends up using, which is a very real possibility on the internet. I believe technology is the largest unlock of human potential ever, right? And if that is so, how do you utilize it in a manner that's fairly productive? I didn't see college very productive for me. So I wanted to see an avenue where it is. Building an org, building a company, building an idea definitely seemed to be a noble enough pursuit of time. Now, as you're on that process, you begin to realize that it takes giving up a few things, right? In the early stages, it's not going to be easy. Nothing that is worth doing is going to be easy. Building a company is especially probably on the top of that list. You're going to sacrifice on a social life. You're going to sacrifice on balance. You're going to sacrifice on sleep. You name it, you're possibly going to take a hit there. And as long as you're okay with it, you quickly realize that you start to become a one-trick pony, which is there's one dimension of your life that ends up uh, growing because you are passionate about it. But in order for it to grow and for you to be the top 1 percentile or the 0.1 percentile in the world as that journey, as that chapter or that search for excellence, start to realize that you're pretty much a one-trick pony then. Like you can do one thing and you can do that one thing really well. And if you notice, there are a lot of people in the world who are one-trick ponies. Some of the best people out there are probably great one-trick ponies.
Is it like jack of all trades, master of one, or like only master of one? Like how do you see it as?
I would say focus is probably the most useful skill that you can develop between your 20s and your 30s. You can be as broad paleted as possible, try a lot of things, yearn for experiences because they teach you much. An experience does not make a lifestyle, right? You don't go skydiving every day, right? Or you're not going to find an AR Rahman suddenly jumping out of bed and saying, "Look, I want to assemble a car today." Like he's going to compose a piece of music that's going to be incredible and bring the world to its knees. Now, that's great, right? Like, does that make him a one-trick pony, or does it make him a super calibrated individual who knows what he's great at and something that he's passionate about? Find your passion. It's usually one thing. And over a long enough period of time, if you're just hammering away on your passion, you realize that that's the one thing that you're outrageously good at as well. And you inevitably become a one-trick pony, I guess.
You see augmented reality currently lying?
Right. So I think for us to truly understand and appreciate AR, we have to look at it as a part of the arc of computing, as I call it as. Like, how does computing really change ever since it started? So when you rewind like 4 decades, 5 decades ago, I think we all started with the punch cards, a punch card system that you put in basic computing and arithmetic that starts off. We go from punch cards to the mainframes, mainframes to the desktops, desktops to the laptops, laptops to the smartphones. And each time there's been a shift in computing platforms like this, it's taken about 15 odd years in order to make that shift possible. So there's always I wouldn't say predictable, but technology tends to take a platform level shift around the 15-year, 12-year mark. And I think there's no reason to believe that it's going to stop with the smartphone, right? And when you look at that arc and the way it has evolved out, the curiosity then becomes on if 2007 was when we consider the first smartphone to be out there, the iPhone particularly. What's next, right? Like what is probably next in that arc, per se. And you can think of a few answers to come through. The first one is voice-based computing, right? Natural language has gotten good enough to a point, and computers have gotten good enough to a point of understanding that it's very ambient. You can walk into your home, ask your Google Assistant to do something, and it does a great job of it. Now, the second method of access is spatial computing. In spatial computing, very specifically, you'd be able to split this out into virtual reality and augmented reality, which is how do I use three-dimensional space and my ability in order to understand 3D, in order to take every screen that's around us. It can be a 2-inch screen on your wrist. It can be a 6-inch screen that you hold in your hand, or a 15-inch screen that you're staring in front of you, or a 80-inch screen, which is in your living room. How do you take these screens, which are X pixels versus Y pixels, and possibly start bringing them into a 3D abstraction?
I had made a video like about 4 months ago about VR taking a big jump just because of the pandemic. Like people are staying at home, so they're more encouraged to seek out new experiences. So do you think that's going to speed up the curve?
I would believe that at this point, the timing is a fairly tricky issue. That's largely because there are three things that have to evolve: the technology itself, the content, and a couple of pieces around the user adoption curve that makes it more practical. Think of AR and VR today to be very similar to what your PDAs or your personal digital assistants used to be back in 2002 to 2005. You see the potential for a PDA to be the next big thing, but nobody's made an iPhone yet, right? There was this middling phase where you had flip phones, and then you had PDAs, and these PDAs, the Blackberries were everything back in the day, right? And every company was trying to be a Blackberry back then. And then there comes a 3.5-inch multi-touch device that completely changes everything. So You're sort of in the BlackBerry phase right now. You know it works. You know it's very powerful. In limited conditions, it's almost context changing in terms of the way you do certain tasks. But it's not there out to tens of millions of people, let alone billions of people yet. That's true. Would something like a pandemic make it faster? Sure, I think pandemic makes a lot of things faster. But is it going to be there in the long run? Is a question that I think is better answered around how do we move from the point of very early adopters who believe in this piece of technology towards uh, a mainstream curve. I'm not even talking about smartphone level adoption. I'm talking about how do you get to the first 20 million, 30 million users as a whole ecosystem per se, right? There are 6 billion smartphones out there right now. So how do you, in comparison, have 20 million odd AR/VR devices that are out there historically? On that journey, I think we're getting closer than ever. The year has definitely made it faster, but I would believe that we still require that one product launch that probably really shakes things up in terms of just mass consumer adoption. We're closer than ever. I think we should get there in a year or two.
Recently, there have been some major launches which have changed the VR segment. Like the Quest 2 came out like last year at 299, which was a big thing in itself. So, like when we are speaking of privacy, so Facebook has only one major concern, which is privacy. So when they announced that in 2021, like which is this year, they are going to release their augmented reality glasses. So the main fear among people has been that they might steal more data, they might get more access to our lives, and some people have very extreme opinions that it will be very easy to like deep fake people or track people because it's on your glasses. And also, how do you see privacy and augmented reality coming together?
If something is sufficiently advanced, AR and VR simply become like the ultimate computing platform where you can do a lot of things inside these interfaces. So I definitely think it poses a very new challenges in terms of the way we think about how technology infiltrates into our everyday lives. Augmented reality is practically another pair of eyes. It sees everything you see. It has the ability to map the space around you using LiDAR sensors, which means companies possibly have access to entire 3D scans of some of the most intimate parts of your lives, such as your home and anything that you do in your daily lives, so on and so forth. We're all becoming sort of a digitally connected version of ourselves, aren't we? Like, for example, an Apple today would have, at this point, your fingerprint because of Touch ID, your face in 3D because of Face ID, your voice because of Siri, and the number of footsteps you take if you own an Apple Watch, your heartbeat. I think at some point we've already begun the process of digitizing a lot of the parts of our lives. AR and VR make it a lot more direct in terms of the ask. Right? It's not subtle; it's in your face, quite literally. Um, I think that's going to be a little bit of a behavioral change to consumers on one side. Privacy is going to take a whole new meaning at that point of time because right now every part of privacy is around textual or media based access, right? With things, images that I have previously clicked or links I have previously shared or texts or information that is personal to me that is usually captured in the past. I think privacy with AR and VR start to focus a lot more on the present as well, right? Am I allowed to see things right then as I'm able to open up the camera and have access, so on and so forth? I don't think we're even geared towards understanding enough of the privacy implications right now. And that's usually the case with a lot of technologies which are groundbreaking. You put it out there, it creates chaos, and then you quickly play cat and mouse in terms of understanding what parts of this is chaotic and how do you build laws and structures of equilibrium around the same. Almost like where crypto is right now, or at least a couple of years ago, right? Which is it's a very gray area in terms of the way a legal structure can coexist with a crypto structure. And that I think will happen with AR VR as much, which is we take some time to understand the implications of the technology, and then we develop frameworks that are going to help keep everybody's interests safeguarded while we have a certain understanding of what use cases might evolve out.
So, I think like, is there going to be a legal angle to it, or would companies like find out like what to do themselves?
I think self policing rarely works, but agency such as a government mandating what you do with technology is even worse, right? Because they're very different in terms of contextual awareness on the things that technology can do. Case in point, drone deliveries in India, right? Like it's such a gray area that nobody knows whether it's right, wrong, can be done, can't be done. I think that's a bigger problem to solve. So neither of these seem to be ideal answers. And this is one of those rare cases where capitalism is a very beautiful instrument. Um, in a free market, what ends up happening is there is enough competition across the board that incentivizes every player to possibly act as a natural system of checks and balances with each other. There are some companies that care more about privacy and user security than the others. There are some companies that care about price and accessibility more than the others. Now that's the beauty of a free market. The ability for companies to challenge each other on a competitive layer and provide the best optionality to the customer and allow the customer then in order to make a decision on what companies care about what parts of the product and thereby your lives, I think is a more elegant way to address this from a capitalistic point of view, as compared to utilizing government frameworks which end up taking too long and are possibly outdated by the time they come in, or self-policing where it seems to be there's such a obvious degree of a bias that very rarely is a institution that demands so much power like a big tech company going to do exactly the right thing.
How do you see like getting out there to escape? Like because earlier current escapism in reality is like you have a phone or a laptop from which you will try to escape, like watching a video or something. So you have a track of reality, like that this 13-inch screen is just it, like it's not here. But in case of augmented reality or virtual reality, we are more or less likely to lose a track of time and all. So like how do you see it? Because like my favorite, like one of my favorite movies, Inception, where they had a totem to realize that okay, this is real and this is not. So like how do you see, like is it going to likely that people are going to lose track of reality?
I think this is long enough if you stare into the horizon. It's a theory called singularity that everybody brings in, or presence, which is you feel so connected to something that is outside base reality, which is simulated, that you are completely believing that is no different or no less or no more than the actual thing. Um, I think it's a very interesting concept. From a technology perspective, we're not there yet. It's going to take a long time to possibly get to a point where these two things become so intertwined that it starts to impact your daily lives altogether. But I think something more subtle might end up happening, which is escapism is already all around us at this moment, right? We walk into the movie theaters in order to be suspended into disbelief for the next 2 hours. We take a trip in order to possibly get away from what is the mundane. So escapism is not a bad thing, right? It's a way for you to deliberately put yourself in a different environment and possibly experience a very different set of emotions as a part of that environment. I think VR and AR VR especially will possibly really change that out for you, because if you're going to wear a pair of glasses and like go through an experience, and that experience can be across the rainforest in Amazon or climbing the Everest or playing a game that's absolutely exhilarating, that unlocks a whole new dimension of human experience that's not been possible before for a cohort of people who can never experience something like that ever. What do I mean by that is people who are too old, people who are in developing countries, people who might
Basically
not be able to
giving
do
new
something from
experiences which are not available to them while they are here.
precisely, right? And that's not from a temporary perspective. That then starts to become a way of life. And that way of life is actually fairly positive if we tend to look at it from that lens. Uh, you're
What
providing for
about
things
like
that
going
people
about like going too into it? Like what about like if you go too into it, because you cannot spend too much time into a movie, while in case of like a, I don't know, headset, you are it's yours at the end of the day and no one else can regulate you until like it would come as a privacy boundary. So do you think like is there going to be a higher chance that it might go beyond the limits?
very much possible, but I believe that's a question around moderation and not a question around the possibilities of the technology, right? Like the reason I say that is I believe morbid obesity is tracing back to the same roots of the problem itself, which is if you cannot exercise restraint, don't blame the tool for the fact that you could not exercise restraint. I'm sure the tools are built in order to keep these dopamine hits on your brain happy, alive. There are engineers, product managers, and entire teams whose daily lives are to build something that is addiction inducing. We've seen that with games, we've seen that with smartphones, we've seen that with fast food. I just believe it's not capped or containerized to just one thing. It's a larger pursuit that every industry over a period of time ends up digging into. Um, and that is simply going to carry forward in AR and VR. So I believe it's a lot of existing human behavior in terms of corporations utilizing small mental models or like mental hacks in terms of getting you addicted to something. And the same theories are just going to be replicated across into AR and VR as well. Is it going to have a more destructive effect? Possibly. Does that mean that the answer is to not do that? Not quite. I think the answer is to help people understand that moderation is a perfectly normal thing to possibly exercise, and thereby allow them to both experience the tool as well as understand what moderation can do in order to help keep things in balance.
Future of no code.
So if you notice today in technology, 0.6% of the world knows how to write code, and a smaller percentage of those folks know how to write something that can build a product. A smaller percentage of that are in startups, and a smaller percentage of that are in successful startups. So you're finding a decimal part of the world possibly generating content and value for 99% of the others. And I think that is a huge gap that's going to start getting filled very quickly. No code as a movement at its very heart has a simple goal. How do I allow or enable people who have been aspiring to create something, have the ability to create something? And any tool that can get you closer to that dream or that goal without you having to learn a programming language is very empowering. You'll see a lot of that over the coming decade. And by virtue of that, everybody around us over a sufficiently long enough period of time start to become creators and not just passive consumers. And a no code era possibly makes that really simple for a lot of these folks. And that's very empowering for society as a whole in terms of just unlocking a whole new wave of ideas.
Do you think no code might be the end for like the software engineer hype which is around, and there are some companies who are literally forcing parents to like put their children into coding, and also like do you think that no code at a point will remove the hype around it, and the only place where code is required is like to build no code?
Right. I believe the problem as of today relies in a supply demand curve, isn't it? A lot of the opportunistic educational or so-called educational attempts towards helping prep kids from a scarily young age in terms of being great programmers, etc., are built around the asymmetry between the number of good companies that require great engineers and the number of great engineers out there. Now, if this problem had to be solved, it probably has to be solved at an engineering college level and probably not at I am 4 years old, I need to start coding level. That's a different conversation altogether. But I think one of the things that no code would solve is bridging this asymmetry between people who can and people who want to, right? And the moment you start bridging that asymmetry, what ends up happening is for the ones who are truly passionate about building something, say you're in college, but you're not a computer science major, but you still want to build something that can possibly be game changing. You suddenly realize you don't need to be a computer science major, right? And taking those shackles off is a very different part of the world that you get to unlock and explore. So the next generation of entrepreneurs are possibly going to have tools, ideas, and ways to go out there to validate these ideas in a curve or a shape that is much, much faster than the previous generation. So what does this make? This makes sure that a lot more of us are going to create, a lot more of us are going to create independently, and thereby a lot more companies are going to foster something like that. So I believe a software engineer or like a developer is perhaps going to be important, but the asymmetry between you have to be only a developer or an engineer in order to do something meaningful is probably going to come down by a lot.
Currently, no code can power like proper websites, small apps, and all. But do you think at a point there would be a point, like a tipping point, where it could power like AAA games, multimedia, like proper level, like which you see on, you could say in some high level animation movies? So do you think like no code will be able to do that in like the next few 5-10 years, or maybe even
That's a very
shorter?
interesting one, right? I believe right now we are literally just scratching the surface, right? Um, the very fact that we can build some useful applications and a huge number of these websites without touching a line of code, in fact, are like multi-billion dollar industries already that have not been fully exploited enough just yet. So think of it as building a skyscraper. We're barely laying the foundation right now. And these foundations are built around these large markets, which have broad appeal at this point of time. A website, an app, um, uh, robotic process automation. So these are areas of no code that seem to have immediately taken off because it's a very painful process to do by code. Over a period of time, you'll start finding niched out no code tools that start to be built on top of this foundation. Now, what if you want a website only for food products, or what if you want to build a menu using no code, or an e-commerce application, a food delivery application? You will find app level specializations that start coming right after. The third layer is where you're going to start finding modality level uh, no code tools that are very useful, which is helping you build a really good game without necessarily coding any parts of that. How do you make building a game very similar to building a bunch of Lego blocks, putting things together, and thereby having results that you're actually proud to show out? And these elements are very underexploited right now. I think the next generation of software will start resembling that a lot. Will start resembling very interactive, engaging, pull you into an experience style building process. Like a Fortnite, right? Like today, it's almost like a parallel world in itself that demands you to follow a certain game mechanic that you're going to possibly build yourself around. Your digital character has thousands of dollars usually poured into it, and it's a whole economy. So I think the no code revolution possibly is going to be like that, a set of rules, principles, guidelines, and ways to build something that has both broad tools, niched out tools, and it'll keep getting better and faster as soon as we start pushing the boundaries a little. I don't think we've started to push the boundaries enough yet, but as soon as we get there, you'll find a newer bunch of companies starting to double down on how do we do that, how do we make that happen, and start to give that to consumers right after.
The major debate which most people have, like, should we work at a startup or a company? So like, where do you think should a person work? I mean, like, how has your experience been while working at a company versus a startup?
Very different, and good in their own rights, right? Like, I think it's important to understand that people tend to view both with a very polarizing side. If you're in a startup, you're possibly doing cool work, or if you're in a company, you're having a more relaxed life. There are some stereotypes that get addended to both sides of the fence. Shake all of that out for a second. I think it's important to start with what do you think is important for you between the ages of 22 and 30? Let's start there. If your startup is sufficiently successful, you're going to be possibly doing that for 5-7 years. A lot of people, when they start in their early 20s, do keep that in mind, right? Which is, it's a marathon, and like it is in all regards and respects a marathon. Startups fail more often than not because of the lack of capital, but because of the lack of conviction, the lack of motivation. I just gave up. Uh, A big company, on the other hand, probably ends up teaching you more by insulating you from that kind of risk in the early stages, so on and so forth. Now, you can look at that in two ways. I want to remain insulated of that risk, but also go through a less steep learning curve, understand from a peer group around me, and then decide what I want to do. Or you might think, I'm at a stage in life where I would like to possibly take the steepest possible learning curve out there, make my mistakes, learn from my battle scars, and possibly in that process create something that the world wants to use. So each bring a unique set of advantages to them. I think you just need to be very deliberate about where would you think the next 3 to 5 years of your life is expended meaningfully, and how do you orient yourself towards that option. So if you make a decision-making matrix around what do I want versus what does that system provide, I think that should give you a fair enough answer per se.
What is like one final advice, quote, or suggestion which you want to give to the audience?
I recently came across this one that says the average smartphone that you hold right now has more computing power than what it took for like NASA to put a man on the moon, right? And the best thing that we decide to do with that is endlessly scroll a feed of pictures. So I think at some point, technology around us is such a treasure trove of opportunity to meet people, make things, build, learn, grow. We simply don't allow ourselves to think or orient that way. The first part is, I think if I were to just look at someone in their early 20s, just possibly trying to, or even in their 18s and 19s, just getting into engineering undergrad, possibly building, possibly going through that process. I would say, how do you go to a creator mindset, right? Like, and I'm not talking about make a video, please, no. I'm rather talking about how do you think from the point of putting something out there in the world and on the internet that people are going to associate you or even better pay you for. Make a dollar of the internet, right? Like $1. Create something that's possibly going to give you that first dollar. But what would you do? Start thinking that way. And then you'd very quickly be surprised on how a lot of things around you start appearing as problems that you can solve as compared to things that you have to put up with. I think it's a mindset level change that possibly is very useful over a long enough period of time that you hold on to that skill.